Welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by Emmy award-winning investigative journalists, Earth Files reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe, and world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham Bentwaters incident, John Burroughs. And now, leading off tonight's program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
8 years ago, on September 27, 2010, retired U.S. Air Force Captain Robert Salas appeared with 5 other former U.S. airmen to give their firsthand accounts at a Washington, D.C. National Press Club event to hear witness testimonies about UFOs interfering with nuclear missiles at all the Minuteman bases in the United States. Retired Captain Bob Salas told the gathering, quote, "The U.S. Air Force is lying about the national security implications of unidentified aerial objects at nuclear bases, and we can prove it. I was on duty March 16, 1967, at Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls, Montana, when a red, glowing aerial object came over and hovered directly above the Minuteman nuclear missile site. Then 10 Minuteman missiles shot down one by one, a second apart for 10 seconds. Incredibly, power had not been lost to the missile sites. The missiles became inoperative by an unknown influence linked to that UFO that caused 10 nuclear missile guidance and control systems to shut down a second apart. And they shut down for an entire day, immune from human efforts to bring them back online in the interests of national security. Then the same thing happened at another Minuteman missile site a week later. There is strong interest in our missiles by these UFO objects, wherever they come from. I personally think they are not from planet Earth," close quote. Boeing was the manufacturer of Minuteman missiles, and I personally talked to Robert Kaminsky, one of the lead engineers assigned to go to the Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana to try to figure out how Minuteman missiles could be brought down one at a time in a few seconds. He told me from an engineer who had worked on and made the systems for the Minuteman, quote, "Linda, it was impossible, and yet it happened," close quote. In official documents released later, Kaminsky was quoted as saying, "There were no significant failures, engineering data, or findings that would explain how 10 nuclear missiles were knocked off alert, and there was no technical explanation that could explain the event," close quote. 21 years later, in 1988, a physics student named Kevin Knuth at the University of Wisconsin in Oshkosh was discussing with his classmates a recent cattle mutilation that law enforcement linked to UFOs there. The physics professor joined the conversation and told them that he had colleagues working at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls where UFOs were shutting down nuclear missiles. Kevin Knuth would eventually graduate with a PhD in physics from the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis and devote his physics research to quantum mechanics, high-quality Bayesian data analysis applied to exoplanet detection. And he is now an associate professor in the Department of Physics at the University at Albany in the SUNY complex in New York. He is also a former NASA research scientist, having worked for 4 years at the NASA Ames Research Center in the Intelligent Systems Division. And for the past 20 years, he has been editor-in-chief of the science journal Entropy. He has over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has been invited to give physics presentations in 13 countries. A few weeks ago, on June 28, 2018, Professor Knuth was asked by the news website theconversation.com, "Are we alone in this universe?" Professor Knuth told The Conversation that, quote, "As a NASA research scientist and now a professor of physics, I attended the 2002 NASA Contact Conference, which focused on serious speculation about extraterrestrials. During the meeting, a concerned participant said loudly in a sinister tone, quote, 'You have absolutely no idea what is out there,' close quote. The implication from the scientist was that he knew there was other life in the universe and not all of it was friendly. Professor Knuth said the silence in the room was palpable after the scientist's words began to sink in to the people listening. And Professor Knuth concluded his interview with these words to The Conversation, quote, "There is a great deal of evidence that a small percentage of these UFO sightings are unidentified structured craft exhibiting flight capabilities beyond any known human technology," close quote. After this short break, physics professor Kevin Knuth will join us on Phenomenon Radio to talk about why he thinks there is evidence of other life in this universe and why the UFO phenomenon seriously needs to be studied on Earth. Professor Kevin Knuth, welcome to Phenomenon Radio with John Burroughs and me. We are extremely interested in the question that you raised in the conversation. Again, are we alone in this universe? And that the answer is probably no, and that it should be seriously researched. And I hope today that where we could start is by going back to 1950, and Los Alamos National Laboratory was playing an extraordinarily important role in the United States coming out of World War II. White Sands, New Mexico was up to its ears with experimentation, trying to get missiles launching, and we were where the first atomic bomb was tested. And in that context, there is something that happened at Los Alamos in 1950 that sort of sets the stage for when that question began being asked by very serious physicists, and how in the world could it have gone from serious physicists to being made fun of? And that is the question that we're all dealing with in 2018, when it seems like we're getting close to possibly that breakthrough headline that we're not alone in this universe. What was it that happened at Los Alamos National Laboratory?
Thank you for having me. Let's see. Enrico Fermi, who was a famous physicist working there at the time, was having lunch with colleagues after discussing UFOs, and Enrico Fermi was renowned for asking interesting questions that would have some teaching value or some deep meaning, and he had thought about this problem and basically asked everyone, well, given the situation, given what we know about the universe and how big it is and how many planets there should be, he basically reasoned that there should be life all over the place, and he simply asked, well, where is everybody? Implying that there should be alien life here, and there should be at least somebody visiting the planet, or detectable, and there doesn't appear to be, and that was his basic question.
And what made it so important, looking back through the lens now of 60-some years, is that I know for a fact, having interviewed people who worked at White Sands, once proving ground, now missile range, that back in the 40s, when the paper chase, the scientists from Germany were brought over to work on the missile development, that there were all kinds of newspaper stories about the intrusions of white glowing objects when we launched rocket missile tests down in White Sands. and they were called peculiar phenomena by the base commander at the time. And that, to me, that's the backdrop that Enrico Fermi and all of those physicists, they knew that they were dealing with something they couldn't identify.
Yeah, well, I don't know how much Enrico Fermi or the other physicists knew about those events, and I don't know precisely what they did know about those events, if they knew about their occurrence. It's not clear really where Enrico Fermi was going with that question, because he very often had a point to asking such questions, and they usually had some kind of teaching value. And it's been traditionally is taken as meaning that that since we don't see aliens around, well, then there's something that we don't quite understand about our universe in the process of the evolution of life and such. And so it's often taken to mean that that he was pointing at the fact that we didn't understand something about life in the universe. Whereas I don't know his thoughts, so that's an assumption. It's maybe it's possible maybe he did know something about these incursions during missile tests, and maybe he was implying that well, they ought to be here, so maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that we see some things that look like they could be related to aliens visiting Earth. I can't imagine what he was thinking.
Well, there was a man, Len Stringfield, who is an author of a very important book called Situation Red, and he served in the Air Force in the 1950s. And in the decade before he died, he had been at many UFO conferences, like around in the late 70s into the early 80s. And he was very straightforward about saying that he knew for a fact in his Air Force work that there had been a standing order in the early 1950s to shoot down any and all UFOs and to retrieve technology and bodies. And when he wrote Situation Red, I did an interview later with him, and he said, Linda, here is a fact that the government has been trying to suppress. He said, we knew how many pilots we lost trying to carry out that order to shoot down UFOs. And he said retaliation from the UFOs was serious, that they brought our planes down. Now, that his firsthand information that was documented in Situation Red, I've heard from other pilots, and you say, well, from 1950 to 2018, there are these layers that imply there not only is an alien presence, but the alien presence brings with it a threat. And some people argue, well, if we were trying to shoot them down and they retaliated, are they good or bad? In that kind of discussion with people that you've had as a physicist about the technology that is just demonstrated by UFOs, what is your own personal experience with talking with anybody who might have information about the craft on or off the record?
I don't really recall having talked to anyone who claimed to have information about such craft. No scientists, certainly. I discussed this a bit with Luis Elizondo, who was head of the Pentagon's program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. So I asked him a question about this just last weekend, asking how such craft could possibly propel themselves, but I think that's probably the only situation in which I've had an opportunity to get information from somebody who might know something more about this.
What was Luis Elizondo's answer to your question?
He basically said that he thought that they were doing something like warping space-time. He's making a reference to what's called the Alcubierre metric, which is an idea that where you could create a bubble of space around the craft and actually transport the bubble so that the craft, those inside the craft feel like they're at rest while they can accelerate at great rates. So that's basically what he intimated.
And can you try in more detail to explain to a general audience what the Alcubierre bubble, excuse me, is?
Oh, well, the idea is that the idea is to warp space and time around you so that you're basically at rest with respect to that space, and then you can then warp the space in front of you and behind you so that this bubble can basically move. And the idea is that you can then accelerate the bubble at very high rates of acceleration, much higher than you could withstand. And but for you, it would feel like you're at rest. The difficulties is that you would have to warp space-time like that requires crazy amounts of energy. So it's very difficult to imagine that this would be possible from an engineering perspective.
Well, I know the group, excuse me, I know the group that he's working with, and I know that they are very interested in layered metal that I have been investigating for 22 years, layers of pure bismuth sandwiched with a magnesium zinc alloy, 97.6% magnesium, 2.4% zinc. And in those layers at the nano level, we've had some physicists who have said that it is the way that the atoms were placed, that these are intelligently created at the atomic level, and that there are skins, and the skins of the craft, one on the outside and one on the inside, with intelligent creation at the atomic level, essentially can neutralize gravity in a bubble around a craft. And as one physicist told me, he said you could blow on the craft and probably make it move because it becomes independent of our gravity and our atmosphere. And is it something like that in the Alcubierre bubble?
No, that would be the Alcubierre bubble would be very different. Basically, you'd have to be warping space-time. So I don't know how layering magnesium and bismuth could shield you from gravity. I've never heard anything like that, nor do I know anything about theory that would lead to that.
They're at least headed in that kind of direction of experimentation. What was it, in your own words, that brought your interest to UFOs?
I had always been interested in UFOs since I was a teenage boy and learned about them. But I think my interest was piqued when I was a graduate student at Montana State University, where I got my master's degree in physics. I had just moved to Montana in the early fall of 1988, and it was probably my first or second week there. It was very early, and they had a cattle mutilation on a nearby ranch that was all over the news and had people very upset. It was quite freaky. And so several of us new graduate students were gathered in the physics department discussing this, mainly wondering what kind of weird place we just all moved to. And while we were having our discussion in the hallway, a physics professor, came to see what we were so excited about, and he joined in the conversation and said, well, this happens from time to time, and sometimes it's associated with sightings of UFOs, and no one ever really figures out what's going on. And he says, but what's very strange? He said, I have colleagues up at the up at Malmstrom Air Force Base who work on the ICBM missile sites. And they have been telling me that they have problems with UFOs flying over the missiles and shutting them down. And after he left the conversation, we laughed about it. We really thought that this was probably one of the silliest things I'd ever heard. The UFOs fly over and shut down our nuclear missiles. And I think that one of the reasons I thought it was, we found that hard to believe was because if this were really happening, this would be a major event. I mean, this would be something that national security would be all on top of, and yeah, I'd imagine we'd have heard about something like this. So I just always thought that was quite strange. And so it wasn't until years later, what would have been about 30 years later, I was preparing for lectures here at the UAlbany in astronomy, and I was in my astronomy class, and I was working on to spend maybe about a half hour talking about the possibilities of life elsewhere. So I was poking around on the internet for interesting information about UFOs that I might be able to discuss with my students. And I stumbled on the one of the press conferences that Robert Hastings had organized, where he interviewed Robert Salas, as you'd mentioned in the introduction, and others who were from Malmstrom, where they discussed that they had in 1967 problems with UFOs shutting down nuclear missiles. And I was stunned. I thought to myself, my God, wait, there's somebody now talking about this and talking about what happened in 1967. And I heard about this 30 years ago. And it was an ongoing problem at that time, from what I heard. And I thought, this can't just be some made-up story. You don't make up a strange story like you. It's hard for me to imagine that the Air Force would have a culture where they would carry such a mythology around with them for over 50 years. That would be disconcerting on many levels, and so. Especially if these people are in charge of our nuclear missiles. So my only conclusion was there has to be some element of truth to this. And, I talked this over with a few of my colleagues, and they said, oh, they're probably just helicopters. And I said, well, that's, it's easy to assume that, but, you could perform a thought experiment. What do you think would happen if you rented a helicopter and flew it over one of these nuclear missile sites? I said, I don't think you'd last 5 minutes. So I doubt very much they're helicopters. They would have shot these helicopters down. Right. So it really piqued my interest, and I thought, well, maybe we need to look a little more carefully at this instead of laughing it off. And because that's what I had done for years after hearing that story. And I found it very compelling that this appears to have been going on for a long time.
And it ties in to Len Stringfield, the retired Air Force man, saying that he knew as an Air Force personnel that we had a standing order in the Air Force to shoot down any and all UFOs only at the beginning of the 50s, like from 50 to 52 to 53, somewhere in there. And he said we lost so many pilots trying to carry that mission out. And he said the families were never told the truth.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. I had heard about the retired pilot Milton Torres, who I believe it was 1957, where he flew from an English air base and he was ordered to shoot down a UFO. And I do remember hearing about that.
Yeah, what year and place was that again?
I think it was 1957, I believe. I don't know what base he flew out of, but they had a large UFO off the coast of Ipswich that he was ordered to shoot down.
Go ahead.
And that was, I read about that in the New York Times, and maybe 2008 or so. And that was around the time that Britain started releasing their UFO files, and I think this was one of their UFO files. So they basically outed his mission, which then allowed him to speak about it.
And have you investigated the R.F. Bentwaters Woodbridge phenomena that my co-host John Burroughs is the only human there who was engulfed by light twice?
I read about it several times and watched a few people give talks about it on YouTube. I'm familiar with that. It's a very interesting case. Well,
I'm going to throw it to John now, because what is kind of like a loop in history, where the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program is going with Tom DeLonge and with Luis Elizondo and the others working together, helped put off at the Institute for Advanced Sciences or Advanced Physics in Austin, is there. You are probably very familiar with terahertz frequencies, but terahertz frequencies were really not known to the general public until we started getting the screening apparatus at airports, the more recent that we go through and put our arms up. That's terahertz frequencies. And it turns out that we have through the MOD releasing a 460-page report, Scientific and Technical Analysis of Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, that was unclassified in 2006 for the first time from UK Eyes Only, prepared by DI-55 for the MOD, that there is a section in there specifically and references Rendlesham Forest and the fact that these frequencies can manipulate human minds and damage human tissues. And with that, John, I'm going to throw this to you.
Okay. Professor, in the article you wrote for Newsweek, you talked about there is no single case for which there exists evidence that would stand up to a scientific rigor. Okay. But based on that, what cases out there have you looked at that would come close to standing up to that? Or is there really not anything out there that would stand up to scientific rigor, to include the videos that were released by To the Stars?
Oh, that's a good question, and it's a difficult question. I don't know if I would really like to get into specific cases, mainly because, as a colleague of mine put it, a sufficiently motivated skeptic can debunk anything, or can believe that they can debunk anything. And all it takes is one person to say, I debunked it, and you mention a case and everybody points at that person and says, oh, so-and-so debunked it. It doesn't matter whether their explanations are reasonable or crazier than, what it's being claimed. So I don't think I'd like to discuss specific cases so much, but I think the difficult situation is that when, for example, the Navy cases that have been released, they released the videos from the forward-looking infrared cameras on the F-18s, and they're very interesting. But the difficulty is that they haven't released any visual photographs of the objects. They haven't released any radar recordings, which presumably they also have. And for a scientist, you need access to all of the available information to be able to make inferences about things, and you're going to want access to the original data, not just the outputs, from certain instruments. So, because you need to make sure that the instruments are working correctly and such. So I think these are things that make it rather difficult. The other problem is that, especially when these phenomena are being studied in a covert manner or where it's classified, you don't have control over the techniques being used during the study. So it's not clear that people are taking measurements in the proper ways that aren't going to cause, problems with the analysis, or you can't control that it's not being done. You can't be sure that it's not being done in a sloppy way, and you need to make sure that your data and the processes during which you use to, the techniques that you use to acquire the data are be done in the highest quality way possible. So I think those are some of the difficult aspects of this.
You mean who has a reality check on government investigation?
Yeah, that's right. Nobody really has a reality check. It's very hard when somebody just comes to you and I said, I took some data, and, oh, well, great. What instruments do you use? Well, I can't tell you that. And, right. The whole thing very quickly falls apart. So that's not how science is done. And so a scientific study is handled very differently than any of these studies.
But wouldn't Boeing's statement that they had no ability, no explanation for the 10 Minuteman missiles to come down a second apart with a UFO hovering right above the missile silo, isn't that proof?
Well, the fact that they have no explanation means that they haven't been able to think of an explanation. Something made them shut down. So the fact that they can't think of it doesn't mean that it was due to an extraterrestrial source. So what I like to call it, I like to say, well, that's compelling, but it's not proof.
Well, okay, you don't want to talk about cases. What proof have you seen that leads you to believe, or do you believe we've been visited? And if you do, why? What evidence have you seen that leads you to believe that, as a scientist, that it's possible? And also, when Linda talked to you earlier about, the, I call it warp drive, the ability to do interstellar travel, do you believe that is possible?
Let's see. I think as a scientist, what I believe isn't really relevant. I'm basically would like to make statements about what I know based on data, and I don't have a lot of data to work with, so this makes this very difficult. But I can say that, in terms of belief, I can say that some things are compelling. In the case of the Commander Fravers encounter in 2004 with that footage that I'd been discussing, the fact that these craft accelerate away from the planes at very high rates of acceleration, much higher than an F-18 can accomplish. That's compelling. That's interesting. You don't have atmospheric effects accelerating away at extremely high accelerations. And even imagining a structured craft doing this is incredibly difficult. So the fact that we don't have explanations, that we don't have prosaic explanations for this or conventional explanations would, suggest that it needs to be studied. And I think that's really the basis of that article. So in the case of the 10 Minuteman missiles being shut down, the fact that the engineers who designed the systems don't have an explanation as how that can happen, suggests clearly this warrants study.
Well, he said that there was no physical connection that Boeing had made that would have allowed, from a human point of view and a human wiring point of view, the ability for any of there to be a sequence a second apart, that it was physically impossible from their engineering standpoint, and yet it occurred. And that in talking with Kaminsky, as I was able to back in the early 90s, he said that they came to the conclusion that this was some kind of a control, an electromagnetic control from the outside, and that it was the eyewitnesses who said there was an approximately 40-foot diameter red glowing round object right above the missile silo when the missiles were shutting down, and that 2 + 2 = 4, that the influence that was doing the impossible was the red glowing object.
I would, if I do know the fact that they saw a red glowing object hovering over, the missile sites while this was happening, certainly suggests that these two things are correlated. The fact that, and the engineer says that it's impossible for it to be shut down, but, it happened. Well, that right there tells you it isn't impossible, because it did happen. So the fact is that the engineer just doesn't know how you could shut it down in that manner. But that means that that's this warrants study. We need to figure out how that can happen.
Well, what was your own perception of Rendlesham Forest, probably the largest military presence for 72 hours of intrusions of lights that were seen by many, many people, and there were witnesses who saw John Burroughs engulfed in light twice.
Right. Well, that case I find very compelling as well. You have a craft that had landed and was inspected. It was inspected for a long period of time. It wasn't just for a few minutes. It was, I think, if I remember right, 45 minutes or something like that is how long the inspection lasted. And
when you say inspection, please explain.
Well, I don't remember who it was who walked. One of the security officers walked around the craft and actually touched it at some point and took notes on this. So,
Jim Pennison.
That's right. Yes. So so he inspected the craft, and I believe it was for on the order of 45 minutes before it took off. And then its takeoff was witnessed by approximately 100 people on base. So. No, I find that very compelling. Yeah, it's a compelling, story. It's not, he took photographs, but the photographs didn't turn out, and we don't have any of there's no other, physical evidence of its presence, save for, the radiation readings that, was it Commander Halt, took, 2 days later, and the measurements of imprints where the landing gear had presumably touched down. So I find these cases very compelling.
And Monroe Nevels was the Air Force guy who had Geiger equipment that he was asked to go and was making measurements at a site in the forest. Mm-hmm. John Burroughs, do you know if at this point in any of the releases, or even going to anything that's been suggested in England, that the 16 millimeter film that allegedly was taken in the forest, that it wasn't destroyed or fogged, or Penniston's photos weren't fogged, that they actually were flown to Ramstein?
Nothing more than was that it's been speculated on. I think, Professor, maybe you can explain to our listeners' audience. You paint this compelling picture that more needs to be done. Okay, but the obvious, easy answer to the question would be, well, the government needs to release documentation. But if you today say an incident took place, and they picked you to investigate it, how would you investigate it? What would you need, and how would you move forward with the investigation?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I don't think that the government just releasing information will be sufficient, because you don't have it, because the data that they collected wasn't collected in a scientific manner. So it's not being done by scientists using standardized procedures and controls, and so I think that the government releasing information isn't going to be sufficient. so if there is an event and they did get scientists involved, then that would be more interesting. It depends what kind of event you have. If you have an object, objects in the sky that you can, or you see some object emitting lights, some of the interesting things I would like to see, photographs taken at different wavelengths. So of course, photographs in the visual range are nice, but the infrared images, such as the ones that they produced from the F-18s, those are also interesting and important. It would be interesting to see images taken at higher frequencies, such as ultraviolet. See if there's you could look at the spectra that are being emitted. The spectra can tell you what's generating the light or where the light's coming from, and that would be very important. So I think that depending on the situation, there's be different things that I'd like to see actually measured. So, but each, what you would do would depend on different situations. Now, if it's a fact where you have a craft that landed and then took off, and then you're investigating the site afterwards, that's very difficult. What you can essentially prove is that something landed there. You can't really prove what it was without having had photographs at the time, and even then it's very difficult, when they're being taken by private citizens or even the government. You have a situation where you are still potentially subject to hoaxes, and science likes to protect against things like that. So these images would have to be taken by a team of scientists actively studying this before I think they'd be accepted in general by the scientific community.
Professor, in those videos that were released in December 16th, 2017 to the New York Times, Politico, and the Washington Post, you were making the point that they released only infrared. What else would you have expected perhaps to see if they had shown radar? Well, seeing radar would be nice, because I'd like to have some idea of the speed of the object at various points, and especially the accelerations of the object. So when the object sped away, what was the acceleration of the object? You have cases where, based on the witnesses' descriptions of some of these objects, you get accelerations that range anywhere from 40 g, which is 40 times the acceleration of gravity, up to, I think there was one case that I looked at and had almost 1,000 times the acceleration of gravity. Now, people can only withstand about 25 times the acceleration of gravity, so in fact, most biological organisms wouldn't be able to withstand much more than that. So any craft accelerating from 40 g to 100 or to 1,000 g, you don't expect anything biological to stay alive. Mm-hmm. Not a large, a multicellular creature, certainly. So so getting data like that would be very compelling. And it would suggest possibly that those kind of craft were self-activating artificial intelligence? Well, it would suggest that they somehow can accelerate at those rates. I mean, we technically don't know how to accomplish that, and I don't know how you could do that and survive it. So, so it would suggest that it would suggest that you do have some kind of unstructured craft with some advanced technical capability, which would be important. Would that lead to the warp bubble itself that you were talking about? A warp bubble could be one explanation, but at this point, I think that's probably one of the only explanations we could come up with, because that's one of the only ideas that is, that I know of where you can achieve those accelerations, with known physics.
Well, you're in that field. Okay, Hal Puthoff obviously believes it's possible. He wrote a paper on that. What would we need, and what would it take to do that? Well, do we have the capabilities? And what I mean by that is do we have the resources available to build something like that right now?
No, as far as I know, we don't. To warp space-time to that degree, you would need a crazy amount of energy, which probably on the order of the mass of the sun, to be able to pull something like that off. So I don't know where you're going to get energies, at that level.
Well, okay, if you were going to try to do that, let's take this from a scientific position, because that's a lot of what, in my opinion, what Hal Puthoff is looking at. He's looking at the capabilities of what we saw in those videos, the technology that could we develop it. That's the funding and that's the research and work that they want to do. What exactly would it take, and where would we need to go to even come close to having some kind of energy source like that?
That I don't know. We'd have to learn how to, warp space-time efficiently, and right now we don't have any easy means of creating gravitational fields except by collecting large masses. So you'd have to carry around the mass of the sun with you, is basically something like that. Now, one of the important aspects about engineering is advances in engineering proceed by doing new things in clever ways, and so maybe you can be clever about it, but I don't know how you would do such a thing. I don't know how to be clever about that.
And Professor, when you were talking with Lou Elizondo last week, did you talk with him about the possibility that the craft in the infrared videos could be intelligent, artificial intelligence programmed?
No, I didn't talk about that. He really was, I felt he was a real straight shooter in the fact that he really talked about only the facts and facts based on what they were focused on studying. And he had said explicitly during his talk several times that they did not intend to study who was piloting the craft, and that he wasn't going to discuss that. So he really stayed away from that issue.
And this was at the MUFON conference in New Jersey, right?
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
And he did a presentation that leaves like to the next step. What did you get as a physicist from his presentation about where they're going to go next into the stars with the technology development?
Well, there he wasn't so clear about what they were doing with regard to technology development. So there, I can't really assess that. That would have required, me really sitting down with him and having a long technical discussion, which I don't think others were really up for. So I really wasn't able to discuss that with him.
Well, they've just announced in the past few days a new division that is focused on materials like the bismuth, magnesium, zinc, layered metal, and other materials that they are going to try now to scientifically investigate and see if there is a way to apply to advanced technology, because the To the Stars announced that their goal was to build a craft that could go to the stars, as they announced.
Right. No, I mean, certainly an exciting idea. I just don't know. I don't know much about the material science that they're aiming to study and what they expect the properties of those materials to allow you to do.
If they don't have the energy source that can drive the craft, and that's your field, and you're not aware on the white side of it, we're even close to being able to create that kind of energy to drive the craft. Why would they be worried about building a craft if they couldn't drive the craft?
Well, that's a good question too. I don't know. I'm not I'm not going to use that to infer that they know how to do it. I don't think that would be reasonable. There are a lot of people doing things that they don't know how to, trying to do things that they don't know how to accomplish. So, but I'm interested in following them and finding and seeing what they are eventually able to do. It's an exciting idea, and I commend them for trying.
Well, along that,
there's only one way to pull this off, and that's to try it, and try to do it.
Just July 31st, a couple of days ago, there were yet again new headlines about spotting the fast radio bursts. And this one is coming in, this is from CNET, which is a very reliable and credible news network. And they're talking about Canada has a new radio telescope. And that for the very first time, the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, known as CHIME, in British Columbia, detected the first ever fast radio burst at frequencies below 700 megahertz. And that was on July 25th, a week or so ago. And the saying this was the first time in what I would say are legitimate news sources that they said this. Possible explanations include bursts from magnetars, exploding black holes, and yes, highly advanced alien civilizations, quote, close quote. Well, it was only in December of 2017 and a few months before that I interviewed Avi Loeb, chairman of the Harvard Department of Astronomy. And he had put a paper out in a journal with the hypothesis that the fast radio bursts that I was just reading about, this most recent one, are light speed transports, the first evidence of advanced intelligence. What is your perception on that?
I would have to read his paper to find out about that. I just learned about these fast radio bursts this morning, so I read about the CHIMES experiment and what had detected this morning, but I don't really know much about the hypotheses other than the fact that it could be signals from magnetars and black holes, and of course extraterrestrial radio signals would be on the table as well.
Right. And I started reporting about fast radio bursts in 2007. There was the first one, and then there have been an evolution over the last 11 years. There was a burst of them just 3 or 4 years ago. And now this is so interesting that this new one at a lower, that below 700 megahertz, it is as if we are expanding our eyes and our ears in our technology on Earth, and what we keep picking up is astounding.
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, the only way to find out about the universe is to look, and that's what we're doing, and we're getting better at it. And so we're learning more, and we're going to keep learning more. And if there are others out there, we will eventually detect them.
Well, what is your opinion about the Webb telescope delay? Some people have said that they think it's because the Webb could see down to, this was one report, that the Webb, if it launches and everything is successful, that it would be able to see Proxima Centauri, the planet, the exoplanet in the Alpha Centauri system, and that the government may not want that kind of detail to be seen on Earth yet?
Oh, I think that there's plenty of other reasons why NASA could, or they could delay launching the spacecraft, having to do with just getting the spacecraft ready. So I think that those are more likely than not launching it, so that you can prevent things from being imaged. I doubt that's the case.
Well, do you think that the Webb will have that much more lens ability that we could see 4 light years from Earth to, I don't know, the surface, but
you may you may be able to image the planet. I mean, we have imaged other exoplanets around other stars already, and so it's very possible that you could do that with Proxima Centauri. But I doubt you'd have any detail that you could. It's very difficult to tell, just even from orbit, looking at Earth. It's very difficult to tell that there's a human civilization on the planet. So I sincerely doubt that you'd be able to detect, life. You'd be able to visualize anything like that with the James Webb Space Telescope.
You'd have to be looking at the atmospheric gases for things like methane releases.
Yeah, something like that. You could detect the atmospheric gases and infer that. You might be able to infer that there could be life on the planet, but I think that's probably the best you could do.
Why is the Webb telescope supposed to be such a huge advancement in the eyes of Earth out into space?
Professor, before you answer that question, the producer just said we'll do our first break. So we'll come back to that question after our first break.
You're listening to the KGRA digital broadcast station, Salt Lake City, Utah. Before we begin hour 2 of tonight's interview with Dr. Kevin Knuth on Phenomenon Radio, it's time for the news, brought to us all by earthfiles.com. Here's Linda Moulton Howe.
There are so many Egyptian mysteries, including statements by U.S. government whistleblowers over the years, that one of the suppressed truths of ancient history is that the Egyptians and Greeks were either full-blood extraterrestrials or human ET hybrids. Their knowledge of architecture and mathematics was so advanced. One of the biggest mysteries is the Great Pyramid of Giza. What were the King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber really built for? And why is there a third unfinished chamber right under the base of the huge pyramid that is 755.9 feet long on each side? That massive limestone structure is estimated to be 5.9 million tons. In July of 1982, I was inside that massive pyramid in the King's Chamber. I was there on a tour with my then husband, and when we entered the King's Chamber, I was overcome by a strong feeling that I wanted to experience what the chamber felt without anyone else there, in order to understand some truth about what it was for. So I asked my husband to go ahead with the tour, and I would catch up in a few minutes. I walked to what seemed like the center of the King's Chamber. I closed my eyes and I waited for what I thought was going to be an intense rush of energy. And instead, it was the opposite. What I felt was like a vacuum, no energy at all, an empty void. In my mind came the thought, this pyramid is a machine. It was built to be empty in order to receive waves of energy. So this week, I was startled when the American Association for the Advancement of Science sent out one of its Eureka alerts on July 30th, 2018, with the headline, quote, "Study reveals the Great Pyramid of Giza can focus electromagnetic energy in its network of internal chambers and underneath the base in the third unfinished chamber," close quote. Physicists from Russia's ITMO University and Germany's Laserzentrum Hanover wanted to know how the Great Pyramid would interact with electromagnetic waves of resonant length with that limestone pyramid. The scientists first estimated that resonances in the pyramid can be induced by radio waves with a length ranging from 200 to 600 meters. Think of waves, and that each dip in height as it comes down, each wave would be 200 to 600 meters. They used mathematical models to understand how photons of light would react with a hypothetical nanoparticle that's down in the atomic world, and that would be shaped, this nanoparticle, if they could shape it exactly the same ratios as the Giza pyramid in Egypt. Dr. Andriy Evolyukin, the Russian scientific supervisor and coordinator of the pyramid research, says, quote, "We as scientists were interested in whether the Great Pyramid could dissipate radio waves resonantly with the goal of recreating the pyramid shape at a nano scale," close quote. That's where atoms are, that small. The scientists assumed that there are no unknown cavities inside the Giza pyramid, only the 3 known chambers, the king's chamber, queen's chamber, and the one that's so mysterious and unfinished deep underneath the base. And that the pyramid is built out of limestone, that is a kind of crystal, and that it is distributed evenly inside and outside of the pyramid. And with those assumptions made, they, the scientists, obtained pyramid-shaped nanoparticles that resulted, to their surprise, in higher levels of energy at the atomic level. The scientists conclude that if the pyramid's ability to focus and increase electromagnetic energy could be applied on a smaller scale, then more efficient sensors and solar cells could be produced for more clean, efficient energy all over our planet. This is Linda Moulton Howe. Please stay tuned to Earth Files news updates on KGRA Radio and visit every day my science, environment, and real X-Files news website, earthfiles.com, for more unbreaking stories about our universe, this solar system, and the planet we live on.
And that's the news brought to us all by earthfiles.com. Now back to the program.
Professor Knuth, before the commercial break, I was asking you, why do you think that the Webb telescope is supposed to be such a dramatic jump in quality and ability to be the finest eye that the Earth has yet produced to look out into space?
Well, for a few reasons. One is that the primary mirror of the James Webb Space Telescope is much larger than the Hubble's primary mirror. So it's about 15 times the area, and the amount of light that you can collect in a telescope depends on the area of these mirrors. So it means that you can collect 15 times more light than with the James Webb Space Telescope than you can with the Hubble Space Telescope. What does that mean? It means that we can see things that are further away, much further away. So, and when you're talking about the universal scales, what you mean by that is that means that you can see further back into time. Things that are much further away, happened, much longer time ago. And so, because it's taken all of that time for the light to get here from those distances. So the James Webb Space Telescope will be able to see much more distant objects than we were able to see with Hubble. And in addition, the James Webb Space Telescope's focus mainly on the infrared regions of the spectrum, infrared and a little bit into the red, whereas the Hubble was focused mainly on the visible part of the spectrum and the ultraviolet. So one of the benefits there is that the dust in space typically blocks visible light, and so very often you'll have dust and gases surrounding stars, and the Hubble Space Telescope can't see through that dust and gas, whereas in some cases the James Webb Space Telescope should be able to see through that dust and gas. So that'll be very interesting.
And if there were other intelligences in our solar system, in our Milky Way galaxy, that cloak themselves with frequencies that we would never be able to see in visible light, is it possible that the James Webb Telescope, with its infrared abilities, might be able to now start seeing actual craft that we have not been able to see before?
Well, I don't know how anybody would cloak like that, but so it's hard to say what any capabilities of observing them would be without knowing how that works. But I would doubt that James Webb would be able to detect any craft. I mean, you're basically focusing the James Webb Space Telescope to very great distances at which, you wouldn't be able to see a craft. So I would think not.
Well, I know that one region in our Milky Way galaxy that is of great interest is the Orion Belt system for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of the hypotheses that has evolved over the last maybe 30 years, coming from people who have studied ancient past in Sumeria and Egypt, have been a hypothesis that the placement of Giza and the other smaller pyramids in the Giza area outside of Cairo matches the way the Orion Belt, where one of the stars in the Orion Belt is just slightly offset from a straight line. And they say that same kind of offset has been measured in Cairo at the Giza Plateau. What is your perspective on large geomorphology and structures like pyramids on Earth reflecting astronomical locations that might relate to other intelligences that come here and leave some kind of an imprint, maybe, millions of years ago?
Well, I don't know about intelligences coming here, but I do know that the placement of the pyramid, those specific pyramids, does match the stars in Orion. Now, the stars in its belt would be going from left to right, or Al-Nataq, Al-Nalam, and Mintaka, and it should be Mintaka's off a little bit from the others, and so we had, and I know that there are 3 pyramids that are aligned very similarly. So I don't find it surprising that ancient structures mirror some of these, some of these stellar patterns. The people in the ancient world spent a lot more time outside with where they were able to see the stars well. They didn't have city lights to have to deal with, so they had much clearer skies, and they spend a lot of time paying attention to the skies, unlike modern people. So the skies, were very important to them, and so I don't find that surprising.
Do you, though, consider the hypothesis that the Anunnaki and the Sumerians were full-blood extraterrestrials, as some people in the government and whistleblower category have said they know for a fact, and that the residue from the Anunnaki and the Sumerians that have been sort of presented to our human history in the last 5,000 years as mythological was done for some manipulative reason, and that in fact they are the evidence of non-Homo sapiens sapien presence on this planet?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what evidence exists that they were not human. So I really can't speak to that. I would certainly be surprised, but
let me tie it to a PhD nuclear physicist, John Brandenburg. He presented a paper at the big NASA conference in California last September of 2017. He was asked to present because he wrote a book called Death on Mars. And his hypothesis is based on the xenon-129 levels in Mars and the presence of and confirmed of trinitite in the Cydonia region in the Northern Hemisphere, and working backwards from data that he got while he was working on his PhD at UC Berkeley from a senior scientist about the Viking measurement of xenon-129 on Mars being 2.5 times that which was measured in the Earth's atmosphere after 1945, when we tested the atomic bomb at White Sands and we dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That Mars would have 2.5 times that amount in 76. That the conclusion, and in discussion with a senior physicist at UC Berkeley, who said, yes, we know that there was an atomic or some kind of nuclear bomb explosion on Mars, and that it all has been kept secret. Now, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm saying this is a background in books presented at the NASA conference in September. Everything I'm saying was presented with graphs, illustrations, photographs. And then John Brandenburg, PhD, ties the Martian history to the Anunnaki and the Sumeria on Earth as being extraterrestrials. So that's the link in science.
Oh, I see. See, I don't know anything about that. I know that NASA's Curiosity rover, which has an experiment called SAM, the Sample Analysis at Mars Instrument Suite. Basically, it studied xenon and krypton in Mars's atmosphere, which is presumably where he got his data. But
from 1976, Viking is the data.
He got it from Viking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the current Curiosity rover has studied this as well, and they found that the xenon and krypton's only part of what's going on. That there is also that there are interactions with barium that they believe are basically changing the isotope ratios of xenon and krypton. And so, as far as I understand, that there's the hypothesis that there's a natural process going on to create these unusual isotope levels is much more reasonable at this point.
And Dr. Brandenburg addressed that in September at the NASA meeting, saying that from his point of view, that was an effort on the government to cover up the truth.
Well, I mean, if you have a hypothesis that has, and you have data for it, the government, I don't know. I would be surprised by that. I think that, that it's much more likely that you have cosmic rays, interacting with barium and bromine that are changing the isotope ratios of xenon and krypton. I think that that's much more likely.
And what do you think about Elon Musk saying he's going to launch to Mars in 2020, and that keeps raising the issue, if they go there, are they going to have to go underground into a lava tube for some period of time with very sophisticated suits? Because there's the issue of how would you terraform the Martian surface that is pretty much filled with chemical. You could remind us what it is that causes the soil to be sort of anti-life, and there are all these questions about how would we terraform it.
Well, first, I'm very excited about what Elon Musk is doing. I think it's very exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing it happen. I don't know what chemical you're talking about. I know that there's hydrogen peroxide on the surface, which can be problematic for bacterial life. So maybe, I don't know if that's what you're referring to.
I'm trying to remember. It's just over the last 7 or 8 years, as they've come through the rovers with data, there have been various reports on how difficult it would be to grow things in the current Martian soil, more than one. And I think hydrogen peroxide is one of those. But it is, what could we do as we're reaching out into our own solar system, and we want to have a base on the red planet that's 3 minutes and 20 seconds by light away from us? And how could we terraform Mars? Is there something we could do with chemistry that could change the soil, quote unquote, astronomically overnight?
Oh, well, I mean, those are big problems. I mean, worrying about certain chemical constituents that is going to make growing plants difficult is a problem that they're going to have to solve. So they're going to have to work on it now before they get there.
Well, yeah, and I wondered, in your exoplanet research, This seems like a fundamental problem that you all would have to be getting together in meetings to talk about. Well, if we're going to try to get to any exoplanet, including Mars, what can be done from any various surface to make it habitable for human life? That's the big question.
Right, and I think that's going to have to be handled planet by planet, because each one of them is going to have very different chemistry. So it really depends on the local chemistry of that planet.
And in our own solar system, we've got Enceladus with an ocean. We have Europa with an ocean. Mm-hmm. And those two right there, they're moons, but they seem to be at the top of everybody's list in our solar system beyond Earth that could have some kind of life in those oceans.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and Europa and Ganymede both have subsurface oceans, subsurface saltwater oceans. Enceladus probably has lakes. I don't think it has, and it would be quite, I don't think it's quite known if it's ocean-sized. But there's also evidence that Saturn's moon Titan may have liquid water below the surface, and Pluto also may have liquid water below the surface. So there's a number of objects in which you could have life living in subsurface water reserves.
And there's that 12-mile wide lake that has just been reported under the South Pole.
Under the Martian South Pole. Yep, that's correct.
And 12 miles by 3 feet deep, possibly, and only 1 mile, I guess I say only, 1 mile down. And what seemed to me that it popped out of that report is that they have found this through various deep ground penetrating frequencies in which certain reflections will say this is water. And now they think that they have a larger map in which to look for other subsurface lakes on Mars. How much have you talked with anybody about the projection of how much water there could be a mile down on Mars?
No, I haven't discussed that with anyone. So it would be interesting to know what people are thinking at this point. You know, it's not going to be known for sure until they actually do the mapping, but it'll be very exciting.
Have you talked with Elon Musk yourself about his mission?
No, nope, I don't know Elon Musk.
Well, if you were sharing with the audience why you are excited about his getting to Mars, what is it you would like to see happen?
Well, I like the idea of colonizing Mars is very exciting and very bold, and I like that we have somebody who's willing to try bold things at this point. I think that's a very those moves are very important, and we often learn a lot from them, and I think that'll be good. And I totally agree with his assessment that humanity needs to be a multi-planet species. It's the best thing for our survival.
Here. Yeah, we could be on a path of destruction here. Well,
that's right. I reminds me of there's a quote from Mystery Science Theater where at one point the little robot crow shouts out, "Spread out, one bullet could hit us all," and I think that's really true.
Yeah, exactly, especially with North Korea and some other factors here on Earth. Well, when you take all of what you have learned and studied so far in your work on exoplanets, what is your expectation of finding life? Because these headlines went around the world that you were just being honest in the conversation.com about saying that there is increasing evidence that there is possibly other life in the universe, and therefore the question of intelligence, advanced civilizations that Michio Kaku is convinced are out there. And in studying exoplanets, what kind of data impresses you, and what are you expecting?
Well, those are good questions. I think that, most of the I think from what we know about still the potential for life on Mars, but also very exciting to learn about Europa's oceans and Ganymede's oceans and Enceladus and so on. I would expect, like many scientists at this point, that life is probably common throughout the universe, and I would expect that you would find intelligent life elsewhere. So I would like to know, and so that's one reason why I'm a scientist and why I study these things. I want to know for sure, so believing, based on what we know so far is one thing, but I would like to be more certain. And so it will be very exciting to actually detect life on Mars or some of the other worlds in our solar system, and then see how that life is related to life on Earth, if at all. And we would learn a lot at that point.
Well, when you were talking with Luis Elizondo last week, did you ask him why in the title of his office in the 5th floor of the Pentagon, it was Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program?
I didn't ask him why, but he discussed some of those aspects in his talk. I mean, one of the military's job is to keep us safe, and if you have craft flying around and that our aircraft can't keep up with, there's a safety component, and that's something that they're going to be interested in. So,
meaning advanced physics is something that would be classified automatically as a national security threat.
Well, I don't know about the physics itself, but I mean these objects are potentially a threat, and so that's something that they wanted to assess. I'm certain of that. I mean, that just as follows.
Did he talk with you about any examples of what they would consider to be hostility with any of the objects that they have been getting on infrared video?
No, he didn't talk to me about that, and we didn't discuss that, and I don't think that it from my impression, he didn't discuss anything like that specifically, but my impression was that they were simply just trying to study these things. I didn't get the feeling that they had adversarial encounters with them at all.
Well, you can see why it is an important question, because Rendlesham Forest and the events that John Burroughs was in goes back to December 26 to 28, 1980. Mm-hmm. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program was not funded in the Pentagon with Luis Elizondo until 2007 to 2012. Mm-hmm. So you have to go back all the way to 1980 as Rendlesham, and then back to 1947 and all the crashes in Roswell and Aztec and Magdalena and Arizona, and there was a bunch. And that these leaps in time, we know that the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration were at least talking with each other, quite honestly, about extraterrestrial biological entities, and those were words that were used in their documents. So that is part of the history of the 40s and the 50s. By the 60s, the 70s, and onward, counterintelligence through the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Organization, and about 10 more. They were given, as I understand it, assignments to put as much distance between the public and media and what our government was secretly learning about extraterrestrial biological entities and their technologies as possible. So today, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program would be like recent at the end of 70 years, and where they were talking about extraterrestrial biological entities in the 40s. You see what I'm talking about, the disconnect between historic documents and today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I follow that. I don't really know what I can say about that. These phenomena haven't been studied by the scientific community, and that's what I really feel needs to change.
But secretly, I and others have talked with physicists who have worked underground at different bases on what they call extraterrestrial technology, that they have seen extraterrestrial biological entities preserved underground, and that everything that the public wants to have presented to the public about other beings and craft and technology is all kept underground with secret underground science programs that the surface life of the planet is kept in the dark about.
Yeah, so I mean, well, without that evidence, I mean, they basically have their word to go on, and science doesn't build up its theories based on people's claims. It builds theories based on data and evidence, and that's what needs to happen.
Well, do you think it is reasonable to question that we've got two categories of science? We have one that is on the surface, and you are a professor of physics at Albany, and there's so many others. And Avi Loeb at Harvard is at least saying that his hypothesis is that the fast radio bursts could be the first evidence of light speed transport. He at least says that and goes on the record. But there's the surface public science. Mm-hmm. And then there is the physically underground, for the last 70 years, secret physics that is supposed to now have gone in already into creating an Alcubierre portal.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly there is science conducted in a classified manner, and that science is by its nature going to be disconnected from publicly operated science. So that's definitely the case, and that's going to be the case. And the question as to what one group knows as opposed to the other is really anybody's guess. You'd have to be somebody who knows about both to be able to make any statements about that openly. So being a member of the public scientific community, for us to assess these claims, we really would have to have evidence. So,
well,
that's basically what I suggested in my article, that this needs to be studied by the scientific community.
And Luis Elizondo and the To the Stars group, they have just released in the past 7 days an announcement that they are now going to start working on evidentiary materials from craft of unknown origin.
Well, that'll be fantastic. Yeah. So if we can get some of that data and see some of that, that would be interesting.
Are you going to work on any of the projects? Were you talking with Luis Elizondo as a physicist who might help them with some like exoplanet research?
Oh, I didn't have discussions with him about that. Of course, I would be interested in working on. I like working on interesting projects, so something like that would be fascinating. If the opportunity arose, I would certainly consider it.
And did in his presentation at MUFON, did he talk about the Elon Musk launch to Mars and how it might be tied into the search for, let's say, molybdenum and gold and other rare elements that we don't have a lot of on Earth and we drastically need for advanced technologies?
No, he didn't discuss that specifically. He stayed focused on ATIP and what their mission was and what their goals were and what they found, and that was basically it.
And meaning the infrared video.
Yeah, well, he talked about what they studied and that they were focused on the technical capabilities of these craft and so on.
Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm really curious about something, okay? because this really gets down to the nuts and bolts for me. Okay, They come out and they to the stars says our goal is to go interstellar travel. Okay, now based on what you understand in physics, we aren't even close to being able to harness the energy to, to have the energy to drive a craft out in the interstellar space. It also appears, based on your knowledge, that we don't have the minerals and stuff to build a craft to do that. So I'm not asking you to say what they're doing isn't, visionary, that we someday could, but based on what you understand, the data you understand, listening to Elizondo and MUFON and what you've read, how close are we to putting any of that together and being possible to do that? Because one of the things that I'm sure you probably know about this program, they did say that we now have a new plasma engine that could cut our time down between here and Mars. But in reality, that isn't even close to what these guys are claiming they want to be able to do. So where do we stand? Are we decades away? Where is this all going? I mean, based on your studies of physics and what you've seen presented by them, the videos and stuff, where do we stand on all this?
Well, as I don't think we're close to it. I think that I don't know what the people at To the Stars Academy expect to be able to do, and what kinds of time frames they're hoping for. But I think that these are very difficult problems, and I'm glad somebody's working on them. The only way to make progress is to work on them, and in fact, it's often said that the only action with a certain outcome is inaction. So it's good to see people active, and that's how we learn things. That's how we will learn to do it. But I think that there are a few things that maybe one can think about. First, one of the reasons for focusing on something like an Alcubierre drive is so that you can effectively achieve faster than light travel, which most people, when you start talking about interstellar travel, the expectation is that you have to go faster than light, and we get that mostly from our science fiction, but that's because in our science fiction you want to be able to have somebody fly off in a spacecraft and fly 10 light years away and do something, and then fly 10 light years back and be home for dinner. Well, that's not going to happen. And so that would only be able to happen if you could go faster than light, which is why people tend to focus on faster than light travel. But the fact is that even if you can accelerate at a constant rate and keep accelerating, you can get close to the speed of light, and relativity in those cases would work with you. So for example, when you get going very fast, the time the people on Earth will, when looking at your spacecraft, they'll see that your clocks are moving more slowly. So relativity actually helps you traverse great distances. The problem is that if I fly 10 light years out and do something and then come back, it'll be over 20 years later by the time I get back. And that's, that doesn't make for great science fiction. But that's another real possibility. So if you, let's see, for example, if you could have a craft that could accelerate constantly at 1G, a nice comfortable 1G acceleration, and if you accelerate it halfway to your destination and then decelerate it at 1G for the other half, you could really do some very effective traveling. You could get to the moon in about 3.5 hours. You could get to Mars in 3.5 days. you could get to Proxima Centauri in 3.6 years. And even though it's 4.2 light years away, you're still getting there in 3.6 years because the time is going more slowly on your, in your spaceship relative to the time on Proxima Centauri. And in fact, at 1g acceleration, you could reach the other side of the galaxy in 21.8 years. So
wow.
So you don't have to go faster than light to traverse the galaxy. So you don't necessarily need an Alcubierre bubble to do it. You just have to be able to keep accelerating. Now the problem with that is our rockets work by throwing fuel out the back, right? And we burn fuel and shoot it out the back. And it's, and to conserve momentum, the rocket goes forward. So the problem is you eventually run out of fuel, and you have to accelerate all the fuel with you, which means that you got to carry a lot more than you would like to. So that's really the big engineering effort there.
Well, question: I probably won't pronounce it right, but they call it, I believe, the VASIMR, or it's VASIMR, and it came out through NASA. And they're building it right now. And they said there's no other rocket that you have seen in the past. It's a plasma rocket. It is used for launch. It's not used for launching things. It's used for things already in orbit. This is called in-space propulsion. Where does that stand? Or are you aware of this? And if you are, where does that stand compared to what To the Stars goals are?
Oh, well, the VASIMR, yeah, that uses radio waves to ionize your propellant. So, and in some of these cases, you can design these things to basically pick up hydrogen along the way and use that to help, so you don't have to carry your fuel with you. So that would definitely save a lot of effort and allow you to accelerate at much higher rates. So,
Professor, do you mean sucking in hydrogen as you go?
Yeah, you could suck in hydrogen as you go in some of these cases. So you don't have to carry your fuel with you, and that makes this much more efficient. So I think with VASIMR, it's expected you should be able to get to Mars in 3 months or something like that.
It's actually said 39 days.
Oh, 39 days. All right.
They've said can travel 10 times faster using 1/10 the fuel, and it says it can make a trip from here to Mars in 39 days.
Yeah, so something like that is much, would be much more feasible, perhaps.
But it uses plasma, correct?
Yeah, it uses a plasma, and so you ionize the gas with radio waves and then and heat it up, and so you're generating a plasma to generate thrust.
Now, isn't radio waves like frequencies, right? That's what you're implying, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's an electromagnetic wave, yeah.
Okay, now that would be taking a generator, correct?
Yeah, so you'd have to have an electric source to generate the radio waves.
Okay, but that would be like a generator, an EM generator itself.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reason why I bring this up is because I'm very intrigued, because you have the quest for interstellar travel, that we need to get out in interstellar space, even though right now we're really not capable of going from here to Mars unless this, they actually claim that they've actually have this, and they're in the process of, they're going to have to put it up there above planet Earth before they have to launch it with conventional rockets, put it together in space, and then send it off towards Mars. But if you go back, first of all, before I go into it or ask you more about it, have you read Project Condign, the British MOD study on UFOs, UAPs?
No, I haven't.
So you have no knowledge or background in that report?
No.
Okay. Well, one of the things in that report led to terahertz radiation, which you're now getting back into frequencies, plasmas, and everything else. So based on your background in physics and this engine that they're working on and stuff, I mean, it seems to me more and more this To the Stars is not very much about are we alone or not, but just putting together some technology to get us out into space to see if we're alone or not. So, I mean, we've got possible minerals here, maybe on Mars or other planets, that we could possibly help build the propulsion system, or even the craft itself. But looking at all the data, looking at plasmas, frequencies, and all that, and even what you saw from the couple of videos released, where does that, as a scientist, lead you to believe? Have we been visited, or is this just an advancement in our own our ability to understand technology and move forward?
Well, I think it's certain. I don't think you can infer that we've been visited based on our activities. I don't think that knowing about what people are doing will tell you, what's happened, here on Earth. But I do think that this has a lot to do with our own capabilities. I mean, we are becoming spacefaring, and I think this is just one of the stages.
But
we're going to eventually want to travel to other stars and to other planets around other stars, and so we'll eventually develop that capability, I believe.
But in the headlines that went around the world from the interview with you in the conversation, it was the English papers were saying, physicists says life is likely out in the universe. And that's why we wanted to talk with you, because I think that from all of the interviews that we have been trying to do with military physicists and all kinds of expertise, I would say that it is fair to put the bottom line that when the Truman administration used the phrase extraterrestrial biological entities as what they were discovering in various deserts in New Mexico and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, to be fair, I wrote my article in the conversation, and there were several articles written about that article that made more fantastical claims and statements and quoted me as saying things that I didn't actually quote. So, anybody interested in reading that article should focus on the one I wrote for the conversation. But, I do think there is a probability that there's life elsewhere, and I'm, would be interested to learn about it if it is.
Well, okay, Linda brought up what Truman administration said, biological. Okay, but didn't the analysis of To the Stars say what we were observing in the gun footage camera, it was impossible for anything biological to survive that?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
How is that possible then? How could Truman say we have biological entities that traveled from somewhere else, landed on planet Earth, yet the stuff that we actually have that we videoed and stuff, clearly they feel it's not possible for something biological to survive something like that.
And sir, we do know there have been lots and lots of whistleblowers talking about self-activating technology that is extraterrestrial, but it does not need any biological prime intelligence to operate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's not clear that there's, based on, if these are structured craft, which they appear to be, based on the observations of the people involved, it's not clear that any biological organisms could survive traveling in them, and they don't necessarily need to be piloted by biological organisms. They could be autonomous craft.
Right.
But I think that's just not known at this point.
And if they are autonomous, then the question that hangs out there for everybody, which it did for Truman, if we are gathering up clones, which they did from some of the crash sites, and these are advanced craft, but the clones are what are in the craft, then the next question is, where is the prime intelligence that made all of this? Clones and self-activating technology.
Yeah, well, it needs to be studied. And so that's what I keep going back to. I would really like to see science study this. It's hard to, it's very tantalizing to hear, rumors from the Truman administration, but I don't know precisely what he and his administration knew. I don't know how they determined what they knew, or claimed they knew.
Well, I have a lot
I would like to see it. I would like to see it studied by the scientific community.
Well, I have a lot of the documents from Truman, and one of the most incredible is from General Twining, Nathan Twining, that Truman assigned. These are documents that nobody has denied. The National Archive has not denied that they are real. And Nathan Twining went personally on behalf of Harry Truman to the Roswell region to study what they found, and reports about the complex, what they were suspicious was some sort of a water-based nuclear engine or propulsion system, not an engine, a propulsion system, and that there were hieroglyphs, that there were hand-imprinted panels that tie into the idea that the entire craft was flown by androids that basically became part of the craft. All of this was in the document from Nathan Twining, the 9 days after they recovered the 3 craft in the Roswell region, July 1947.
Right, and I would find that personally, I would find that interesting and compelling, but it's not scientific evidence, and that's what I'm really interested in as a scientist. So.
Well, Professor, I think we're running out of time, but I guess I want to summarize my take on this interview, and I'm not trying to make this sound negative, but to me, it sounds like there's just this little group of people that keep all this data and everything secret from the rest of us.
Right.
And until they bring people in with backgrounds like yours and want to open this up, and I personally, now more than ever, based on what I followed to the stars since December, feel they're just as guilty as the government is. And are they going to use it? They're not going to say this is classified data like the government likes to say, but they're going to say this is commercial type,
proprietary.
Proprietary that we have to keep to ourselves because we want to be the ones to build it. But, oh, by the way, we're not going to bring in people, with your backgrounds into this. So if this is just going to continue to be this big secret, we know more than most, the government itself is keeping this secret because it's national security, then you know what? We don't really have that much of a chance to go anywhere because just a few minds working on this look how far it hasn't gotten us. So unless they want to bring in people with this background, open it up and give it a chance, I don't see this going anywhere anytime fast. I just see this as a more of a money play and a theoretical thing that they're still working on, but they're not really willing to share. And if they claim this is so important to the future of mankind, you'd think they'd want to open it up a little bit more and allow more people to get involved to further this along. Because if the possibility is really there, then why would you want to hold it back? That's just my take on all this. And I've become quite frustrated, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I appreciate that attitude. I think that you're you have good reasons to feel that way, and I really think that this is one reason why the scientific community should be involved, and they would do it, and they would do it openly because that's the nature of how science works. And so, if it's being studied by a company or if it's being studied by the government and they're doing it covertly, then it's not really going to go anywhere. And even if they release the information that they learned, the scientific community is still going to look at, well, how do you know? How do we know that you performed your studies carefully and you know what you're doing? And I think that it's really important for scientists to get involved and study it themselves.
And right, as we close, one more question to you. This isn't something one country can do on its own. I mean, the resources, the funding, and everything that's going to take to pull this off is going to have to be a worldwide effort, because we just don't have the money to do this, to build these craft and do all this and colonize Mars, unless we work together as one. And to be honest with you, I just don't see that happening either. So do you agree that it's going to take a worldwide effort to further this, just to get us into space and get us out there, let alone are we alone?
Well, I think getting us into space is going to take a lot of efforts from a lot of people. And, it started, the process, starts out as something that governments do, and then then moves into the private sector, which it's done now. And eventually it'll become more public, I think. And I think we're evolving, and it takes time to evolve. It took time for us to develop the automobile and get to the point where the people were, using it and using it regularly, and the same with the airplane. And it's going to take time for space travel as well. And I think it's happening.
Let's hope it's sooner than later. Professor, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yes.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight here on KGRA Radio for another fantastic edition of Phenomenon Radio Live. For John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, our honored guest, Dr. Kevin Knuth, I am Race Hobbs saying thanks for listening. Stay tuned for 3 more hours of live programming with Jimmy Church and Fade to Black right here on your contact for the very best in UFO paranormal talk radio on the planet, KGRAradio.com. Have a great night and a great weekend, everybody.